All right, so now we're going to talk about the respiratory system. And this is the respiratory system right here. The respiratory system consists of the nose, the nasal cavity, then we work our way back into the pharynx or the throat, and then we continue down and you have this fork right here, and we're going to go anteriorly into the larynx, and the larynx is going to take us into this next part, the trachea, and then about midway into the chest the trachea are going to divide, and this becomes the right main bronchus and the left main bronchus. And then what happens is that once these bronchi enter the lungs, they branch and branch and branch. Okay, they branch about 23 times until eventually they get super small, and they form what we call these bronchioles, and eventually they end in these air sacs here that we call alveoli. Okay, and you'll notice that wrapped around these air sacs are these capillaries there, and those are the pulmonary capillaries. Okay, so what is the goal of the respiratory system? Well, the goal of the respiratory system is to allow oxygen to move from the atmosphere into the blood and carbon dioxide from the blood into the atmosphere. And that's going to occur right here at this respiratory membrane. Oxygen is going to move from the atmosphere in these alveoli into the blood, and carbon dioxide is going to move from the blood into these air sacs here. So you can think of the respiratory system as a gas exchange system. It's a gas exchange system between the air and the blood, and this occurs at the lungs, specifically across what we call the respiratory membrane there. All right, so why do we need oxygen in the blood? And here's a diagram to explain that. Well, we need oxygen in the blood because oxygen is a critical component of cellular respiration, where we take glucose and turn it into ATP. All right, oxygen is also required in that process. So here we go, we have oxygen in the atmosphere, and that moves into the lungs, and it moves from the air into the blood. And once it's in the blood, it's able to be delivered to the cells of the body. And in this case, we're looking at skeletal muscles. And skeletal muscles, especially during exercise, they need to produce ATP. So they need both glucose and oxygen. Okay, so that's why we need oxygen circulating around in the blood, among other things. But if you remember, a byproduct of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide. And what happens if carbon dioxide builds up in the body? The body becomes acidic, so we need to get rid of that. So that carbon dioxide moves into the blood, and what do we do with it? We move it from the blood into the air, into the lungs, and then we breathe it out. So with respect to CO2 here, the respiratory system is involved in maintaining pH balance of the blood. Okay, it enables us to get rid of CO2, and if we couldn't do that, the body would become acidic. The pH would go down. And so the respiratory system is involved in maintaining the pH balance of the body. These next few slides are just some additional things the respiratory system does besides gas exchange. So the respiratory system is also involved in the maintenance of blood pressure. Okay, and when we get into the kidney and the urinary system, we'll talk about this in maintaining blood pressure. But there's this 3-step process between the liver, the kidneys, and the lungs. And the result of this is going to be the production of a molecule called angiotensin II. And angiotensin II plays a critical role in maintaining blood pressure. And the formation, and in particular what it does is it's a vasoconstrictor. It's going to cause blood vessels to vasoconstrict. And the lungs produce an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme that enables angiotensin I to be converted to this angiotensin II molecule. So the respiratory system is involved in this. What else the lungs do is they filter out small blood clots from the bloodstream, and they dissolve them. Okay, so there is presumably enzymes in there which are filtering these blood clots and dissolving them. And that's important because if you have blood clots rolling through the blood, then it can cause an embolism here, where you have the lodging of this embolus, this blood clot inside of a blood vessel. And if that occurs in the heart, cause a heart attack. In the lungs, it causes what's called a pulmonary embolism, and if that occurs in the brain, can cause a stroke. So again, the lungs are involved in filtering these blood clots and then dissolving them. Okay, so there's an upper and lower respiratory tract, and we're going to start with the upper, and essentially all of that right there is the upper respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract consists of the nose, the nasal cavity there, what we call the paranasal sinuses. These are sinuses that are next to the nasal cavity, but they're not part of it itself. And then we have the pharynx, or the throat. And then we have the larynx, or the voice box. So those are all part of the upper respiratory tract. So what does the upper respiratory tract do? Where the upper respiratory tract filters air, and it has a few different mechanisms to do this. Well, right off the bat, here we have the nose, and this is what we call the nasal vestibule. Well, there's a bunch of hairs in there, a bunch of coarse hairs in those nostrils, and what those do is they filter particles. Okay, particles go through there and they get stuck in that nose hair, and that prevents it from getting further down the respiratory tract. Now, most of both the upper and lower respiratory tract is lined with this epithelium right here. This would be the lumen of the trachea, and it's lined with this epithelium. What is that epithelium? Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells. So pseudostratified because it looks like there's multiple layers, but they're actually not. There's just one layer of cells, and all of those cells are able to touch this basement membrane there. So they're pseudostratified. It looks like it's stratified, but it's not. They're ciliated. We have cilia up there, and we have these goblet cells in there. All right, now how is this all going to work together? What's going to happen? What's going to happen with these goblet cells? Goblet cells, as you guys know, are going to produce mucus, and this mucus is going to line the respiratory tract. It's going to line most of the upper and lower respiratory tract. And why do we have that there? Well, because bacteria and viruses or anything else that's in the air gets trapped in that mucus. And also in that mucus, we have lysozymes, which are antibacterial enzymes. And so they're going in there and killing these bacteria and whatnot. Okay, now what do the cilia do? So after we have all this contaminated mucus up there, we want to get rid of it. And so what the cilia are going to do is they're going to propel that mucus up on out of the respiratory tract. Okay, next the paranasal sinuses. Para means next to, so these are, let's start with sinuses. Sinuses are open chambers that we find in the skull. They're basically cavities that we find within the skull bones. That's probably a better way to put it. They're cavities, empty spaces that we find within the skull. And they're found surrounding the nasal cavity. And we have 4 of them here, and you guys can go ahead and label these. Here is the first one up there. Now again, we find all of these within bones of the skull. And so which bone of the skull is this going to be inside of right there? That's the frontal sinus. Okay, what about these guys down there? Those are the maxillary sinuses. What about all of the... Well, these paranasal sinuses are also lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and they're actually connected to the nasal cavity by these little tubes. So they are connected to the nasal cavity. And so what happens is that air that comes in the nasal cavity is able to go into these sinuses, and it basically serves the function of filtering air. Okay, it's doing the same thing that's inside those. It's doing the same thing that the epithelium is lining the nasal cavity. And if these become contaminated with bacteria, they become inflamed, then one, that can hurt, but two, it can also clog these little tubes that connect it to the nasal cavity, and that makes you feel nasally and all that kind of stuff. Okay, let's talk about the formation of the nasal cavity, or what forms the nasal cavity. This is the nasal cavity right there. Okay, and you can see here's a maxillary sinus right there to the side of it. So let's see. First off, there's 3 bones that form the nasal cavity, and all of this up here is the ethmoid bone. Okay. Then this part right there is the... I don't have that up. Is the vomer. And then those guys there are the inferior concha bones. Okay, there's the vomer. So those are the 3 bones that pretty much form most of the nasal cavity. Okay, and here's the nasal septum. So this is the divider of the nasal cavity there, and it's formed by 2 bones. First of all, it's formed by, on the ethmoid bone, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone forms the most superior part of it, and then the vomer forms the inferior part of it there. So collectively, those guys form the nasal septum. Now, something I want you to notice, and this is a good picture to look here, the nasal cavity is not a straight passageway. You have these little teardrop kind of projections, or these folds inside on both sides of the nasal cavity, and we call those nasal concha or turbinates. And the reason that's important is because when air comes in the nasal cavity, instead of just going straight forward, it gets twirled around in these turbinates there. It creates turbulence. And what that does is it throws air particles up against the nasal epithelium. And so what happens is that if there's dust or pollen in the air, then that gets thrown against the nasal epithelium, and it gets trapped in that on the mucus-coated surfaces. So those big heavy particles, basically, they get trapped in the nasal cavity because of these nasal concha, these turbinates, along with the mucus. Okay. Here we have a frontal section, anterior view, and there's the nasal septum right there. Actually, maybe we can draw it like this. This would be the perpendicular plate. That is the vomer. And then you can see these nasal concha. Use this color. These nasal concha right there. And then you have a couple down below, and these are actually their own bones that form those are the inferior nasal concha bones right there. So you can see, air goes in there, and it's not a straight passageway. It gets deflected through all those things. What else can we find in here? Well, if this is all the nasal cavity here, there we have some sinuses. Those are the maxillary sinuses right there. Let's see. Here is part of a frontal sinus. Okay. Okay, some other functions of the, well, I guess this falls along the same function here. All of this has to do with filtering air, cleaning air before it gets down deeper into the lungs. So another way that this happens is within the nasal cavity, within the nasal epithelium, you have sensory nerve endings. And if those sensory nerve endings make contact with irritating particles, it triggers a sneeze reflex. So we detect that information. It goes to the brain stem. Where in the brain stem does this occur? Not sure where this occurs in the brain stem, but this is the sneezing center. And what does it do? It activates motor neurons that activate muscles that are going to cause the sneezing. And what are we doing here? Well, we're eliminating whatever that irritant is out of the body. So it's a crude but effective way to eliminate these things from the nasal cavity. Another thing that happens in the upper respiratory tract is we warm the air and we humidify it. And the reason this is important, what we really want is this air to be humidified. Dry air causes irritation of the respiratory tract, so we want to humidify it. And to humidify it fully, we have to warm it up. And so we warm it up, and that allows it to hold more moisture, which is what we want. And so how does this happen? Well, right underneath the nasal epithelium, you have a whole bunch of capillaries and thin-walled veins. And what happens is that air rushes across that, and it takes warmth from those capillaries. And so the capillaries are warming the air. And like I said, warm air holds more moisture than dry air, so it allows it to be humidified. And by the time the air reaches the bottom of the trachea, it's warm to body temperature and it's 100% humidified, which is right where we want it. Okay, so we were just in the nasal cavity right there, and you can see these turbinates. The next place the air goes is the throat. And all of this is collectively called the pharynx or the throat, but there are three different areas of it. First of all, we have this area, the pharynx, that's right in back of the nasal cavity. So what are we going to call that? That is going to be the oropharynx. Then we have this part right there, which is right in back of, sorry, my bad. So what we have here is the first part of the pharynx that's right in back of the nasal cavity. So that's called the nasopharynx. Then we have this part right back there, which is right back of the oral cavity. That's called the oropharynx. And then we have this third component, which is right in back of the larynx. So that is called the laryngopharynx. Okay. And what's the purpose of the throat? Well, it's an air passageway. Okay, we're basically just trying to get that air down to lower parts of the respiratory tract. But we do have other stuff in here. We have tonsils in the back of the throat, which we call the adenoids, and this is lymphatic tissue. It's involved in the immune response. Okay. All right, so now we go from the larynx here, or the laryngopharynx, into the larynx, which is this entire structure right there. And the larynx is also called the voice box. What does it do? Well, it provides an open airway into the trachea. This is the trachea right there, and so it's going to allow air to pass from the laryngopharynx through the larynx here and get down into the trachea, which is what we want. What else is it going to do? Well, it's going to seal off the larynx. It's going to seal off the trachea when food is being swallowed. And that's going to be the job of this guy right there, which is called the epiglottis. And it's going to come down and it's going to fold down and it's going to seal off the larynx and the trachea there so food can't get down it. And lastly, we have the vocal cords here. These vocal folds there are going to be responsible for voice production. And this is a superior view here. You can see these are the vocal folds, and this guy right there is the epiglottis. All right. So let's talk about the structure of the larynx here. All this is the larynx, and what it is it's an arrangement of cartilage, membranes, and ligaments. There's 9 cartilages that are connected by membranes and ligaments. And so you have all these different cartilages right here. There's 9 of them that are they're part of the larynx, and they're held together by these membranes and ligaments. Okay. One of the important cartilages that I'd like you guys to know are these, this is an anterior view, are these big plates on the anterior surface of the larynx. And these are the thyroid cartilages, also known as the Adam's apples. And you can palpate those there. Okay. So this is just showing how here we have the larynx and the trachea below it, and this is showing how we close off the larynx and the trachea during swallowing. Basically what happens is when you swallow, the larynx is pulled upward, pulled superiorly, while the tongue pushes down. And what that does is it bends the epiglottis there, and it tips it over, and it causes it to seal off the larynx there and keep food out of the respiratory passageway. So you can call the epiglottis the guardian of the airway. And if for some reason liquid is able to make it down there, liquid or food, you know that, okay? Because what happens is it goes down to the bottom of the trachea, and right where the trachea forks, there's this little piece of sensitive cartilage called the carina. And if anything other than air hits that carina, it initiates a violent cough reflex to expel that substance. And it is a violent response because you want to get that fluid or food or whatever it is out of the lungs. Okay, these are the vocal cords here, which are involved in voice production. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but basically, as air rushes up from the lungs, it causes these vocal cords here to vibrate, and it produces kind of like a duck call sound, a vibrating sound, which is not how we talk. And so what else happens? Well, it produces that vibrating sound, and then as that sound moves up through the pharynx, up through the oral nasal cavities, the sinus cavities, what all that does is it serves as a resonating chamber. Okay, it amplifies the sound, it enhances the sound quality, and so all that is occurring through those open spaces as well. And then additionally, to pronounce things correctly, that involves muscles in the pharynx, the tongue, the soft palate, as well as the lips. They're going to shape these sounds into consonants and vowels. And so it's a pretty complex process that not only involves the vocal cords, but most of the upper respiratory tract in one way or another. Okay, so now we're down to the lower respiratory tract. And the lower respiratory tract consists of the trachea. I'll do different colors here. Trachea, the 2 main or primary bronchi, and then what happens, like I said, it branches, and all of this is part of the lower respiratory tract. And so it keeps branching until it eventually gets down to these blind-ended air sacs that we call alveoli. So these are the smallest branches right there, And then, like I said, they branch and they give way to these air sacs called alveoli. And this is where gas exchange is going to occur. And lung tissue consists primarily of this alveoli. Okay, so let's start with the trachea, also called the windpipe. It goes from the larynx through the neck into the superior mediastinum there, right above the pericardial cavity. And like I said, it ends by dividing into two main bronchi, which enter the lungs here at about the mid-thorax region. And the main purpose is for air travel. Now, what you might notice here is that the trachea is supported by these C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage, and we call these tracheal rings. So there's about 16 to 20 of these, and they're these C-shaped rings. Well, what purpose do they serve? Why do we have them there? As you can imagine, it keeps an open airway. It keeps it patent. It prevents it from collapsing. And this is a nice diagram right here. This is the esophagus, and you can see all that thick muscle layer in there. And then if you move anteriorly, you have the trachea. And there's the lumen of the trachea. Here's our epithelium, our pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And then, like I said, you have these C-shaped cartilaginous rings that are going to help keep the, that are going to be responsible for keeping the trachea open. And you can palpate those. Yeah. So I guess the point here is that we have these tracheal rings, and then these tracheal rings continue into the lower respiratory tract. So the upper parts of the respiratory tree, these main bronchi and these first branches up there. Okay, so this is kind of a schematic of all the branching that occurs. So the trachea divides to form the right and left main or primary bronchi, which enter the lungs through a slit called the hilum. Once inside the lungs, each bronchus branches about 23 times to form the respiratory tree. So you can see all these different branches there. It's becoming smaller and smaller. And eventually you get to these passageways that are smaller than 1 millimeter in diameter, and these are called bronchioles. And bronchioles empty into the alveoli. So here you have these small little passageways, and it's the bronchioles that are going to feed the alveoli with air. Something else I want to point out is that what's happening to the cartilage here as we get further down. Okay, it's becoming more, it's basically going away. You have these rings, and now they're forming these, and now you have these rings, and then it forms these plates there, and then eventually when you get down to the bronchioles, the cartilage is pretty much absent. Okay, but we do have other stuff there. So these are the bronchioles there, and as you notice, there's not cartilage around there, but what do we have there? We have this bands of muscle that are wrapping around the bronchioles there. And what's the purpose of those bronchioles? What's the purpose of that smooth muscle around the bronchioles going to be? That's going to allow for bronchoconstriction and bronchodilation. And why is that important? So we're basically going to be, we can expand the diameter of the bronchioles, or we can constrict that smooth muscle, and now the bronchial diameter decreases. And why is that important? Well, it's regulating the amount of air that's going into the alveoli there. What do you think is going to stimulate this smooth muscle there? Well, that's going to be the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. Yeah, and specifically, what happens in the rest and digest response? We're going to cause bronchoconstriction. Okay, and then when you're in the sympathetic response, it's actually going to be epinephrine released from the adrenal gland that's going to cause bronchodilation there. And this has applications to asthma here. Yeah, you can get inflammation in the bronchi there, and so they can become swollen. Also, the smooth muscle around the airways can tighten, which makes it difficult to breathe as well. So if you're having an asthma attack, what type of medication do you want? Well, you want a bronchodilator and also an anti-inflammatory. Okay, so we went through the bronchioles here. Now we're in the alveoli, these air sacs, and on top of the alveoli we have this dense plexus of capillaries. So we have a dense capillary bed that's over these alveoli. And what this does is it forms what we call the respiratory membrane. And so here we have an alveoli, and there we have a blood vessel, and together they're going to form the respiratory membrane. And this is the membrane that gas is going to have to move across to get from the air into the blood and from the blood into the air. So let's take a look at this membrane real quick. Well, first of all, these alveoli are just a single cell layer thick. That's simple squamous epithelium there. And so the respiratory membrane consists of the wall of the simple squamous epithelium in the alveoli. Here we have capillaries. What are capillaries made out of? Simple squamous epithelium. And so the wall of the simple squamous epithelium of the capillary also forms the respiratory membrane. And then they kind of have a little common structure there. So basically, though, you have this, what's relatively a thin barrier there. Okay, this thin respiratory membrane that's going to be responsible for moving gases across it, or allowing for that at least. Yeah, here's a schematic of how we get to the pulmonary capillaries. Blood moves from the right atrium into the right ventricle. Ventricles contract out the pulmonary trunk, right pulmonary artery, branches, and eventually it gets to the capillary bed, and this is where gas exchange occurs. And then oxygen-rich blood returns to the left side of the heart, and when the ventricles contract, that shoots it out the aorta into the systemic circulation there. And this is a cool picture here. You can see just how dense these capillaries are in the lungs. So I'll try to, I have some pig lungs in the freezer that were taken right as the pigs were slaughtered. And the reason I like this is because of the color. The color of these lungs is super red, which is their natural color because there's so much blood in there for that gas exchange purpose. And here we have kind of just a cross section or a frontal section of the lung. And what I want to point out are all of these little holes there. It's basically like this spongy tissue with all these little holes in that. And that's mostly alveoli. Okay. Yeah, if you take histology from the lungs, this is what it looks like. Like I said, most of the lungs is alveoli, and these are all individual alveolar sacs. And then they have capillaries that are wrapping around each of those alveoli there. So a lot of empty space in the lungs. And that's good because we use that for gas exchange. There's air in there. Okay. Another thing that I want to point out is that all throughout the respiratory tree, this is the wall of the respiratory tract here, we have a bunch of elastic fibers. Elastic fibers are found throughout the respiratory tree. And why is that important? Well, it's going to allow for expansion and recoil of the tree during breathing. Okay, then we have the lungs themselves. The lungs are kind of conical. They have a broad concave base that sits on the diaphragm. So the diaphragm sits right there. And then they have a blunt peak that we call the apex. And the lungs have different lobes. This is the right side. The right side has 3 lobes. And the left side only has 2 lobes. Okay, why is that the case? Well, we need room for the heart. And like I mentioned earlier, when the trachea come down and they branch into the bronchi, they enter through the lungs through the slit called the hilum. And so not only are the bronchi going to enter, but pretty much any vessels you want entering and exiting the lungs, you want to pass through this hilum here. So here we have the PA. What's the PA? Those are the pulmonary arteries. Okay, here's the PVs. Those are the pulmonary veins. So all of that, and then here's the bronchi, or the bronchus. And so all that enters and exits the lungs through this hilum there. Hilum is just a general term for this kind of slit-like entrance. You'll see these in the kidney as well. Okay, and then this is just kind of a a nice picture that you can look at and try to give yourself some orientation. But this is a cross section, and it's an inferior view. And so here you have your lungs. There we have the hilum with all these things entering and exiting. So you can take a look at that. And finally, a fun fact: whales have lungs and breathe air just like us. But their nostrils, instead of being located on the front of their face, are located on the tops of their heads. And so this allows them to, to come up and breathe from the top of their head. If you look close, you can see that there's this nasal septum in between there as well. So that air goes into the blowhole, and then it goes down through, these other structures, goose beak and stuff. Not. Then it gets into the trachea, then it gets to the lungs, and then you have gas exchange like what normally happens. So what's happening here? Is that inhaling or exhaling? That's exhaling, and what's the gas that's being exhaled there? CO2. Okay.